Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, the next panel that we have is a very exciting one indeed. We've covered regulation a few times during the conversations today, but the insights that we're going to have on this discussion will be a little bit different. Now I'm going to introduce our moderator for this, and then the guests will speak for themselves as well. But starting off, we have Fox Business's Susan Lee. Welcome to the stage. Thank you so much. A round of applause for our moderator. Thank you. Yes. Oh, he's fine. And then we'll welcome on our speakers as well. So we have some fantastic speakers for today. Targ Patience, if you welcome to the stage. We also have, everyone can just come at once. It's all okay, I don't want to. We have Gregory Zerzan. We have Jay Clayton, the former SEC chair and former commissioner of the CFTC, Chris Giancarlo, and Bruce Fenton. So amazing conversation. Susan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I know it's near the end of the day, but we're just so happy to be here. We know we have trains to catch for our Senate GOP candidates down there. Hi, selfie time, how are you? So we're here to talk about regulation, and I would say that's probably the most pertinent topic right now in cryptocurrency. Everybody wants to talk about what the government's going to do. Does it have teeth? What exactly does Yellen and what exactly does Jay Powell, what do they intend to do for the space? And I'm so happy to have a wonderful, wonderful panel to discuss this, because I think we were talking backstage and I wanted to save a lot of it for the floor for the actual panel itself. So I will start by asking the obvious, and everybody's talking about Luna, not what Mike Novogratz is gonna do with a tattoo, but what happens to regulation after this blow up and this crash in a stable coin that maybe we should have seen coming? So I'll start with Jay Clayton, the former SEC chair.
Well, thank you. Gosh. Well, all right, let's just go to stablecoin and regulation of stablecoin, and what does that mean? There's a range of products that have been identified as stablecoin. Those products range from, Luna, Terra, which algorithmic stablecoin backed by theory, to a stablecoin that purports to be tied to the dollar but is backed by credit instruments, to all the way to the other end of the spectrum, a stablecoin that is backed one-to-one with cash.
So you're saying they're not all made equal, is that what you're saying? So it's buyer beware, know what you're getting into.
That's the question. Do we have buyer beware? Know what you're getting into? You could buy any one of those, one being much more risky of quote unquote breaking the buck than the other. My personal view is where we're headed is, and where I think we should head, is the government should say, here are the characteristics that make a stablecoin, that make it equivalent to a banking product, that it has the full faith and credit of that type of institution or full backing. Why? Because it's an incredible technology. We see it every day in the marketplace. Chris and I were talking earlier, $50, $60 billion in transactions a day using stablecoin, more efficient, but we need to know it's secure. Now I know others have a different view, so I'll stop there.
I'll go to Christopher Giancarlo, the former chair of the CFTC. So what do you think?
Thank you, Susan. From my conversations on Capitol Hill, there's been an emerging consensus, I think on both sides of the aisle, about the potential for stablecoin legislation this year. And I think when I say there's a consensus, I think the middle ground where you could bring Republicans and Democrats together is exactly where Jay said, which goes back to our fundamental traditions of financial instrument regulation, disclosure, and registration. And so I think you could see a type of stablecoin legislation that would reflect that stablecoins should have adequate disclosure around their material components, and some degree of somebody standing behind that with some degree of auditing capability, so that users of the stablecoin can rely on that disclosure and know what's there.
So it doesn't sound too aggressive,
If I could jump in and agree with everything Chris said, and also say that would be the start of tokenization in the traditional financial system. A very good place to start, where we can move out from there into commercial paper and other instruments.
Okay.
And I'll just add one last thing, Susan, that is, what does Terra mean for this process? It's already begun, but I think we are now, our government are the folks that brought us never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yes.
So I think that they won't let this crisis go to waste, and I think you'll see an acceleration of those efforts to bring some regulation around stablecoins.
Yeah, he's currently the ambassador in Tokyo, so he's kind of far away right now. But Greg, given that you worked as a U.S. Assistant Secretary at the Treasury, what exactly does regulation look like for stablecoins?
Well, I think Chris and Jay are correct that there is an emerging consensus in Washington on regulation, and that should scare the hell out of everyone. No one is forced to buy stablecoin. And there are no shortages of laws describing what are deposits, what are securities. Regulators are not shy about using those powers. And so the idea that some new law is now going to solve, whatever the alleged problem is a chimera, right? It's simply not true, and it's not going to happen. So I think it is very possible that we will actually have some sort of new regulatory push on stablecoin. The question is, why would that possibly be necessary? Who would benefit from that? Certainly people who want institutional stability would benefit from that. Well, great for them. I don't know that the rest of us benefit from that. I don't think anyone told me I had to buy Luna. There was a choice I made. So I would agree and disagree with my colleagues. We're all, members of the same political organization, but as you can tell, there's a little disagreement in the area.
Let me just say that I agree with you to the extent that let's put it this way, to the extent that there are stable coins backed by commercial paper, I think they should be regulated like money market mutual funds, because that's what they look like.
Yeah, and I think, this is really the issue, right? The great thing about distributed ledger technology is it is a universal machine, right? It's a computer. Anything you can do with a computer, you can do through DLT, and you can represent that with crypto. You can tokenize it, right? So yeah, you can tokenize securities, you can tokenize deposits, money market mutual funds, and the fact that they're digital doesn't make them not those things, right? But conversely, the fact that they are digital doesn't make them those things, right? And so people need to exercise the authorities they have rather than create this idea that, oh yeah, the regulators are going to save us. I'm not sure when that has ever been a successful strategy.
Didn't you used to work at the Treasury? And that's your feeling on governance and oversight?
It was a more libertarian time when I worked there.
I'm going to go down this aisle from a libertarian Senate candidate in New Hampshire. And Bruce, what do you think of regulating stable coins? What exactly, does that mean that we need FDIC insurance then on stable coins?
I don't think so. I'm with Gregory. I don't think we need any new regulations on these things. I think we should have less regulations. Regulations have a price. And we see, we have one of the fastest growing, most exciting industries in the world, and we're losing it. This was, when I grew up, when I started my financial career, I was trained right down at the Trade Center. That's where I took the Series 7. This was the biggest city in the world for finance. And we're losing the most exciting, most innovative industry in the world. We're losing it. All the exciting companies, all my friends who I've been in crypto with for the last 10 years, the billionaires, the people who've built these businesses, they don't want anything to do with this country. They don't want anything to do with America. America is known globally as a place that is unfriendly to business. They don't want to work here, and so it has a huge price. But to Greg's point, what's the benefit? It's not like these things are ever going to be solved. Decades and decades ago, people sat in a room and they wrote the 1933 Act. And they said a stock is, stock bond, evidence of indebtedness, debenture. These are the definitions of a security, and we've got to protect you. Well, it hasn't worked. It didn't work for all this time, and there's a huge, huge price. And now we have businesses and startups who are trying to raise money, and they're trying to build a business, and they're worried about rules that were written by people who are dead now. These people aren't even with us, yet the regulations stay on. So when we say something like, oh yeah, sure, we should have this kind of stable coin or this sort of definition, these things last forever. There could be people when we're long dead who are still suffering from the regulations that we have, just as we have people now who are still suffering from the regulations.
Well, why don't we listen to the European, speaking of regulation, Targ of idclear. You live in a heavily regulated area.
Yeah, so I live in Gibraltar. I spend a lot of time in London. And I've worked on the industry side through a huge amount of regulatory reform. And I think asking what is Luna going to mean in terms of regulation, it would be naive to not assume that it's going to be, as has been mentioned by a couple of the panels today, it's fuel for regulatory intervention.
Right, so doesn't it just play into the hands of DC lawmakers then, the Yellens, Jay Powell?
Absolutely, I think internationally, and that's kind of the key point. the session itself is looking at government regulations, lessons learned. One lesson we've learned is regulators will intervene. And another that we have learned is that there are massive differences or nuances between how regulators approach things, which is what leads to Bruce's very, very good point of the inefficiency of regulation. But where I fundamentally disagree is, even though there are plenty of examples of poorly executed regulation that make things less efficient, that may be poorly executed, that doesn't mean that regulation as a whole is bad. It would also be naive to assume that the example that has been set by actions in crypto markets would inspire some bonfire of regulation to say, yes,
Okay, well, conversely, though, you've heard a lot of people in the crypto space saying if you lay the foundations, you put the parameters around the industry, and that's actually pretty bullish. We know where we can go from here.
Absolutely. So Europe have drafted the markets in crypto asset regulation, and there they've tried to define different types of stablecoin. So as you stated, not all are born equal. You might have something algorithmic. The issue with Luna is it was predicated on a concept derived from game theory. And whilst there were plenty of people who made the decision to invest in that, I don't know what percentage of those would necessarily understand game theory or what the ramifications were.
Again, they're adults. You sign consent forms when trading these assets, right? Jay, you're looking at me like we should be handholding more of these investors.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of consensus as to where we are, which is in America, we decided a long time ago that if you're raising capital for the general public, you are going to be subject to a very rigorous disclosure regulatory regime with draconian liability. We decided that a long time ago. We also decided that if you're going to invest in a pooled vehicle, a mutual fund, anything where someone is managing a pool of assets, that's going to have similar rigor if it's offered to the public. Finally, we decided if you're going to have liquidity transformation products where you think you have $1 today, but it's backed by longer dated instruments, we're going to have heavy prudential regulation. That's the landscape that we're dealing with. And what's fascinating about what crypto has done is it's brought global products to the US. So there's a lot of places where it's not as rigorous. It's also brought a lot of efficiencies that we haven't seen in the past. And we're grappling with that. But that's the landscape that we're dealing with. And I think Greg makes a really good point that, should we continue to have that landscape?
Susan, I wonder if your audience knows where the world's first, best, deepest, most liquid regulated crypto market exists. It exists right here in the United States. The Bitcoin futures market and the subsequent Ethereum futures markets are the world's deepest, most liquid, most well-functioning markets in the world. They're very well regulated. The United States did it before anywhere else. And so when I hear the United States is so behind, it's so bad, yeah, there are some aspects that we're getting wrong, but there are a lot we're getting right. The reason why Bitcoin is priced in dollars is because we launched Bitcoin futures on a dollar-based exchange here in the United States. They're not priced in euros, they're not priced in yuan, they're not priced in currency. The United States was first, and today is still the best.
I was thinking Singapore, but Greg, you had something to say?
No, I think, so these are all great points, right? We do have laws, we have regimes. I think, the securities laws, we've updated, from time to time with more onerous and more onerous regulations. I remember I was Mike Oxley's lead counsel when we passed Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002, and that law was, going to address the errors of the dot-com boom, and the markets were now safe. And then, of course, in 2008, the world blew up, and so we passed Dodd-Frank because, that's going to make the world safe. And if you were one of the, 5 largest money center banks that had to be bailed out by hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars, it was a great law for you, right? Not sure it was for anybody else, and it's a real disincentive to list in the United States. And I mean, the thing that gets me about all this, right? I've heard several times today people talk about crypto as being the wild, wild west. Well, for those of us whose families actually settled the West wasn't wild, it was free, right? Freedom is good. And so I think, we have these avenues, right? We have existing laws, but the idea we're going to create some sort of new regime for crypto, and that's suddenly going to make it safe or it's going to make it more attractive. I don't think there's any evidence for that. What there is evidence for is in 1996, we had this burgeoning technology called the internet, and Congress passed a law, 26 words, that said basically you're not responsible for the content of what people put on your web page or your internet service, right? Those 26 words allowed the most successful creation of wealth in the history of the world. And what it actually was an exclusion from regulation. It was protection from regulation. So if crypto needs anything, it needs a law passed that protects it from regulation.
Interesting. So, wow. Free markets. Don't we love it? But you just brought up Dodd-Frank. I think that was the last bipartisan and congressionally passed financial services law. That was back in 2010, I want to say?
It was the last patch of the legacy financial system.
Wow. Okay, so that's what I'm getting to about
and as you know, the world has been safe ever since. I mean, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet didn't go from 4 trillion to 9 trillion today with all that money going into the banks because thankfully Dodd-Frank solved all of our problems.
Okay, you're not being facetious at all. But Bruce, given that you're running for your New Hampshire Senate seat there, can you trust Congress to agree on anything, on any passage of future financial law?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things they agree on, but a lot of times the things they agree on are bad. I mean, Congress isn't that smart. All they need is one bad crisis or something that's the news item of the day. Somebody, assassinates Zelensky and uses Bitcoin, and all of a sudden they're going to lose their minds. And who knows what crazy nonsense they'll pass. These are the folks that passed the Patriot Act. When I started as a financial advisor in the 90s, I could open an account over the phone, and they didn't have to pay for a week, and I didn't need their driver's license, and I didn't need their social security number. And now we take it as some sort of birthright that we have to give all of this to financial institutions, and if we don't, the whole world is going to fall apart. So yeah, they pass laws all the time, and they're usually stupid laws, and they're usually counterproductive to society and to growth. So yeah, they could agree on things, but I don't trust what they would agree on.
I've got to come back on this one because there's something far worse than Congress making crypto laws. And that would be the Financial Stability Board, the FSB, making crypto laws. It would be far worse because basically it's a collection of the world's central bankers. And the worst thing we can have is central banks and their resistance to innovation and forward thinking making laws in this regard. So as shaky as you may think Congress is, at least there are Congress. At least they're focused. They've done innovation right back in the 1990s with the do no harm approach to the first wave of the internet. If we can encourage them to take the same approach, the real risk is that we get these global standard setting bodies that are dominated by the world's central banks and dominated, quite frankly, with our European friends that are very focused on debt-based markets and not capital-based market-based economics. And I think that would be far worse than Congress making the laws.
And I think it's a very good point in that lawmakers don't necessarily have the depth of understanding to write good, functional regulation that is going to enable a market.
Jay, what do you think? Aren't you a regulator in past history?
Let me take another side of this. I think that the capital market regulation in the U.S., let me say through the 90s, was so effective, relatively effective at raising capital, that it has now been used to bolt on all sorts of other policy objectives, and that has been a real shame. Instead of it being a disclosure-based, cure asymmetry, provide protection from manipulation scheme, it has gone to all sorts of lengths to take care of other social issues because it had been so effective. And we are now living through that. I used to, when I started doing this, if a company was $100, $200 million company, enterprise value, there was a good likelihood that it would be a candidate to be a public company. Say, be a public company, use your currency. We're now at the point where, a $4 billion company, it's a toss-up. A $10 billion company, it's still a toss-up whether you should be a public company because we've added so much in terms of obligations. The good news is we've had a private market that has grown dramatically, and capital has remained nimble in the private markets. One of the issues with crypto is those private markets are generally restricted to institutional investors. And crypto has sought to reach retail investors.
Right.
So it doesn't fit within that nimble, lesser regulated private market setting. And that's one of the clashes that we're seeing.
Right, so it gets back to the buyer beware, Greg. And I just wanted to ask you, because there's talk right now of maybe charges against the founder of Terra, Do Kwon. Did he commit fraud? Did he betray, manipulate markets? Do you think that he deserves to maybe face trial?
I mean, this is a great point, right? Which is that fraud is illegal everywhere in all places at all times, right? So if you don't, impose the panoply of securities laws that were written in the 30s to describe markets that existed in the 17th century, it's not as though people can just go ripping everybody off, right? So, I wouldn't comment on that particular case. I don't know, but the reality of it is, it's not as though that would be an excuse to pass some sort of new, law that really got that bad actor, because those laws already exist.
But there are things that we have that are prophylactic, like custody. One of the reasons we have custody requirements is if somebody does commit fraud, you know where to go get your remedy. So, there are things to think about. I will say that you're exactly right, Greg. Fraud, one of the things we haven't seen emerge is state attorneys general enforcing general fraud laws in this space. And, if we have more turmoil, that's a place to be.
And why do you think that
cognizant.
is? Why do you think state attorney generals have not stepped in?
They've had other things occupying their time.
You have more pressing issues to take care of, right? But so does this then maybe speed up the process of developing a digital dollar? The U.S. says, okay, well, we'll handle the stable coin market. John?
Well, 2 years ago, I did an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling on the United States to advance its efforts towards a digital dollar. And I was very pleased to see the the Biden administration call the need for exploration to be urgent. Now, there are many points of view on a digital dollar, but I can tell you right now that Chinese have already put a digital yuan in the hands of over 100 million of their citizens. And it's not just for domestic consumption, it will be for export. Countries in the world that want the features of a digital yuan, surveillance and others, will be purchasers of CBDC in a box, courtesy of the People's Bank of China. And you can imagine 10 years from now, a third of the globe using that, whether they're using it for those features to surveil their citizens or whether they're using it because they're client states of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And so I do think the United States, and I disagree with Randy Quarles, I do think we need to be cognizant of what other nations are doing around the world. And I do think we do need to advance. Now, whether we deploy a central bank digital currency is a second question, whether we use it for retail or wholesale use. There are many arguments why we should. There are arguments why we shouldn't. The most important issue is its design and whether its design protects individual privacy and not just consumer privacy, but fully accords with the Fourth Amendment right of citizens to privacy. If we were to get privacy right in a digital dollar in a world of a surveillance coin populated by China, the digital dollar would be the killer instrument. It would be the application of aspiration for people around the globe. But if we don't get privacy right, if a digital dollar is just China light, then I think we'll do more damage to the dollar than anything else, and we'll see people go to Bitcoin and other privacy-protected digital currencies in the future.
Okay.
Which would be great. I mean, what you said about China is the biggest selling point to not do it. To say like, oh, let's copy China and do what China's doing, but we're going to do it better and protect privacy. Our government just hasn't shown that they can be trusted. They cannot be trusted to do that. They haven't been trusted through any administration. If we give them the power to if we make a central bank digital currency in the United States, means that politicians, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Trump fan or a Biden fan, picture the politician you like least, whether it's Pelosi or Trump, giving them the power to shut down our money is absolutely unacceptable. It's game over for our country. Can't have it. Can't have it.
Okay, so Bruce, so we've outsourced the First Amendment. We've outsourced the First Amendment to the private sector. We're letting big tech do speech. And how's that working out for freedom? They're
It's
stifling.
working terribly
Okay,
because government is interfering. Government is telling government is telling Facebook what to say. They have a misinformation board.
But they're
that
not
they've
going to do
just
the same
created.
thing with money?
Of course
Bruce
they do the
Fenton for
same. That's why
US
we can't
Senate.
trust them.
Bruce
That's why we
Fenton
must
for
say
US
no to
Senate.
central bank digital currency. We already have better digital
the
currency.
private
It's called
sector-
Bitcoin. It's called Bitcoin. It's better. We don't need mother government coming in here and telling us, oh, we're going to do something better than Bitcoin.
Right,
They
well,
can't
here's
invent
the-
something
here's
better
the-
than Bitcoin. They can't do it, and if they do, it will destroy our country because
public
they will
debates.
have the power. Can you look me in the eye and tell me that you can guarantee that these tyrants aren't going to have the power to shut our money down? Because you know they're going to. They're influencing Facebook. They're influencing Twitter. They're shutting down speech. If we give them the power to shut down our money, it's game over.
Give me a
That's
break.
it.
But give me a chance. I'll look you in the eye now.
All right.
Okay. When you let the private sector do money, they're going to do the same surveillance and the same censorship that they're doing with
Good, and I can
speech.
leave. I can leave private sector. That's the difference. With mother government, if
where?
Biden
To where?
or
Yeah,
Trump or
let
Pelosi
me-
decides to
where?
shut down your
All
money,
right. Gentlemen,
let
gentlemen.
me just jump in here. I don't think that we need to give government more control over the relationship with the citizen and their money in order to tokenize money.
but if government does it, they're going to be in charge of it.
What I'm saying is, I think that we can tokenize the way money is provided by the private sector today,
Right.
without having
What
that.
what you said earlier, right? Which is different than the government. running it.
Which I do think is very important. For many reasons, including, I don't know that the government has the technological sophistication to provide a digital tokenized dollar. Look at how much money our money center banks and others spend on cybersecurity, tech, and the like. I can't see the Federal Reserve spending that kind of money and being that forward-leaning to have that kind of privity with a private citizen. So for both, what I would say, both privacy reasons and functional reasons, I believe it should stay in the private sector.
As much as many people may be opposed to the concept of regulation, all of those protestations aren't going to stop it happening. And so, whilst you may be diametrically opposed to the very idea of it, I think the issue is, and a key lesson to be learned, is that regulation's coming, and the most important thing is to engage. So as we mentioned earlier, those who are drafting this don't necessarily understand. And there's some great examples of that. In Europe, when they started regulating algo trading and high-frequency trading, there were initial regulatory proposals which would have required every firm that was doing algo trading and every exchange that permitted it to break the laws of physics. And there were some beautiful responses to the public consultations, but it relied on the industry advising them, understanding what their objectives are. And Dodd-Frank's another perfect example, right? That's in response to the great financial crisis. There was the G20 meeting in 2009 in Pittsburgh. A raft of commitments were made, and the principle underlying that was global standards for global markets. The big problem is that we do transact internationally. Dodd-Frank was drafted, and then Europe seemingly did not bother to read it or engage with the US regulatory authorities, and wrote a raft of regulation that did the same thing in different ways. So I was working in industry at the time.
I think the argument is if you don't regulate it, then you ban it. And I just wanted to get back to what Jay was proposing, and that you think crypto, correct me if I have this right, but you think a digital dollar, crypto, should be regulated like a tokenized security. Is that correct?
What I was saying is that to the extent you're creating a digital dollar, and people have a digital entry that represents dollars, doing it through the private sector is going to be more effective and more robust than trying to have the Federal Reserve or some other government entity have that direct relationship with the consumer.
And then who has the oversight then?
Well, it's the same way we function today.
So is it the SEC? Is
Well,
it the CFTC? Is it the Federal Reserve?
The Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the OCC all regulate banks today. They all regulate money providers. You could do the same thing
So this
and allow
is
tokenization.
But this is the system we have now. Our money is digital, right? There are about 5 trillion, roughly, physical dollars in the world. Our national debt is $30 trillion. So if everybody turns in their bonds, there's not enough actual physical money in the world to do that, right? Our money is electronic. So this whole thing about, the digital dollar really comes down to one or two options. One is people say a digital dollar, they really mean individual accounts at the Federal Reserve. right? And so the Federal Reserve is effectively my payment app, and I can just go peer-to-peer, right? There's a lot of reasons that's a really terrible idea, and it's not going to happen. I mean, the next senator from New Hampshire pointed them out, right? That's terrible. But then the other option is you could create some sort of distributed ledger technology, right? And you could completely outsource it and say, okay, here's the dollar, right? The problem with that is the United States government would go bankrupt, right? Because the fact of the matter is, if the Fed can't just print money, which they have been doing, going back to my balance sheet expansion example, right? Then we go bankrupt. So the whole idea of this digital dollar, unless you create some sort of peer-to-peer system where I can effectively have cash on my phone, but in the form of an electronic dollar, and I don't have to hold my non-cash money in a bank, right? Unless we create that system, there's no point in creating a digital dollar.
Yeah, Giancarlo.
Yeah, you know, these guys may be right? A digital dollar may be a terrible thing, and they may be right that by yelling about it now and making a big fluff, that'll stop the federal government from doing it. But perhaps maybe I've just been around too long and spent too much time in Washington. I think it's coming. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's coming. And so therefore, I think we need to emphasize the issue of privacy. Privacy is a design choice in any currency system. If we get privacy right, and we do have a Fourth Amendment, by the way, we start with a constitutional right to privacy whenever the government does something. If we get the jurisprudence right, we get the design choices right, and we build privacy in, then theoretically, it could be better than what we see today in the public square, where the private sector has taken over speech and has decided not only to surveil it, but to censor it. So my point is, you guys may be right. Maybe a digital dollar never happens, okay? But for my money, it probably does. And therefore, I feel that if we as a free society get out now and emphasize the essentialness of privacy and emphasize the Fourth Amendment and get that design choice right, a liberty coin compared to a surveillance coin, a liberty coin put out by the US or Europe compared to a surveillance coin put out by China, could empower the dollar for generations to come as the world's strongest instrument.
Okay, I have 10 minutes left.
Let me just respond to that. The only way to ensure the privacy is in the code, because you can't trust people. If we come out with the best digital dollar, we get all Republicans and Democrats, they all agree, hey, we can't have this go down the same road that everything else the government has ever done goes down, and we're going to make it right, it will still get corrupted.
Okay.
One administration,
Bruce,
two administrations
we got 10
from now.
minutes left.
Sure. All right.
We'll talk about your New Hampshire Senate run at the end as well. But here's my last question on crypto regulation, and then I individually want to go through some other issues like Elon Musk, which is I'm dying to ask Jay Clayton about. He knows. I also want to talk about Pennsylvania and the GOP Senate race. Actually, we have Idaho and also North Carolina tomorrow night as well, and Bruce can add to that. But what do you think the future of regulation looks like in the next 12 to 18 months here in the US? And I'll start with you, Targ.
I think I can speak a little less about necessarily US regulation, but I think that the most important thing is industry engagement. And so in the absence of the industry having a common message and understanding what the objectives are and how to more effectively reach them, it will be a mess. And that's not just the US, it will be anywhere else. I think the regulation is definitely coming, but without the industry, as they did throughout all of the financial crisis regulations, there was a lot, ISDA, for example, were very influential. There's a lot more sort of fragmented messaging from the industry. I think the important thing is to engage. I think privacy is one of the key components. And without that, I think the regulation is going to be uncomfortable and messy.
Okay, Greg, regulation,
yeah,
but not
so
a ban, right?
The prospects are awful because if you saw the president's executive order on crypto, that a lot of people in the industry, were like, oh, this is great, right? Yeah, that thing's a complete disaster. It asks everyone from the Environmental Protection Agency to Homeland Security to the Department of Justice to the Department of Commerce, literally almost every single federal agency, to come and say, hey, how are we going to regulate crypto, right? That's not good. Who thinks that's a good idea? So I appreciate people in the industry trying to, put a good face on things. Until there's a change in leadership, we're going to see more and more aggressive enforcement actions. We're going to see worse and worse ideas for regulation. And it's not going to be good until we pass the Section 230 for crypto.
Jay.
I think we'll see, actually, depending on what side of things you're on, you might like this or not like this. I think we'll see very limited legislative action and probably very limited interagency coordinated guidance. If we have it anywhere, I think it'll be in the areas of custody and stablecoin. And I would if you want clarity, I would tell you to push those areas because they're the most likely to succeed and move on from there.
Will we get a spot ETF in the next 12 to 24 months, do you think?
You know, let me pass on that one because people will claim I have an interest in that even though I don't.
Right, what do you think then, Christopher? Punted, your turn.
So this is an election year, and I think after 4th of July, very little will get done. I think there's a chance that stablecoin legislation gets done in this Congress, and probably that chance has gone up because of Terra, or Luna, but I think that's the only thing that would get done this year. I do think you'll see things get done in the next Congress. The industry is spending a lot of time and a lot of resources to support a lot of leaders on both sides of the aisle that I think may come together next year. I think the one thing you'll see perhaps after stablecoin legislation, the next most likely thing, is to give the CFTC authority over spot commodity-based cryptos, which is Bitcoin and Ethereum, basically 60% of the market. I think you could see that in the next Congress. And I just want to comment on one thing that Greg said. I agree with him. I think the president's executive order on crypto had a lot of peculiarities, but I'll point out one for your audience that they may appreciate. Isn't it interesting that when the government assigns to the private sector a comment period to come back and give them comments, it's 30 days. But when the government says to the government, we need you to comment, oh, you got all the time in the world. You got 180 to 365 days. So it's interesting how government realizes that commenting on legislation takes time and it takes thoughtfulness. And it's a shame they don't allow the private sector to take the same thoughtfulness that they give themselves.
Yeah. So yes to a Bitcoin spot ETF in the next 2 years?
Well, that's out of my lane. That's the SEC's lane as opposed. I am pleased that when the SEC did approve a ETF, it was based upon the CFTC's Bitcoin
Correct.
futures.
Yes. So you're going to punt on that as well,
Let me
right?
just come back
Okay.
to the reason that the SEC had not approved one was whether the spot markets had enough depth, resiliency, surveillance to make that possible. I think people would continue to make the case that we've achieved that.
And if the CFTC is given jurisdiction over the spot commodity-based crypto market, I think you could then see the SEC come out with an ETF on it.
Okay, I'm glad we're in agreement there. Bruce.
Yeah, I agree with Chris that and Gregory about the Biden order being concerning. It's concerning whenever government does this. So, I'm cautious over the next couple of years. But I think big picture and long term, we should recognize that we're in kind of a fourth turning. The whole world is changing very, very rapidly and radically. None of us would have even come close to predicting anything that happened over the last 2 years. So absolutely anything could happen. And what I hope, we're going to go one way or another. We're either going to go the way of China and a way of authoritarianism, and we've been going that way recently, or we're going to go way of freedom. I hope we go the way of freedom.
And who wins the primaries tomorrow night, in your view, Bruce?
Hopefully whoever is the most liberty candidate. We'll see.
All right. So, Greg, since you worked in government, any commentary on the type primary GOP races?
Yeah.
Pennsylvania, by the way, is a neck-to-neck race right now.
Yeah, no, I think whoever wins the GOP primaries in all of these races, I hope wins in November.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that one more time.
I said my only comment is that I hope whoever wins the GOP primaries wins in November.
Okay. Crypto-friendly candidates is what you're looking
candidates,
for.
very important.
Yeah, that's going to be a very interesting race. So since we're talking about the main topics that's sucking all the oxygen out of social media, Jay, I have to bring up Elon Musk. Since you were the head of the SEC and everyone's asking whether or not he can walk away from this Twitter bid without any lawsuits or fraud.
That is largely not a securities question, but actually a Delaware corporate law question. But the bar for walking away from an agreed public merger deal is actually quite high. It does happen. But generally, it's because there's a very substantial regulatory concession that needs to be made, or the business has changed dramatically or was not what was promised. And that is a very high bar. Sometimes transactions get renegotiated if they're approaching that bar and people agree, rather than arguing over whether the bar has been exceeded or not, they agree to a price change. But by and large, most deals that get signed up are pretty locked up, and that's where we stand.
Right. So if he pays the $1 billion breakup fee, he could just walk away.
No, if you read the contracts closely, there's also a performance obligation.
Correct.
So, you can sue to have somebody actually perform, trying to at least cut their equity check, to be simply.
Yeah, well, the SEC also doesn't have a good track record of actually collecting on the fines that they levy on individuals and companies anyways.
Actually, I'm gonna make a
I'm
plug.
testing him
I'm
at
gonna
6
make a plug.
p.m.
There are, well, at least when I was there, I don't believe there was any meaningful outstanding fine for a registered entity. It's the non-registered entities that you have a hard time collecting from, which is why you gravitate toward registration.
And I just want to thank our wonderful panel for putting up with my questions and indulging me and being wonderful with regulation and their outlook on crypto. Thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.